I never imagined a simple stone wall could turn into the biggest neighborhood disaster I'd ever witnessed. But that's exactly what happened. The strange part is I didn't destroy anything out of anger, I didn't threaten anyone, and I never tried to get even with my HOA. I simply gave them exactly what they demanded, and 12 days later half the hillside they had been standing on came looking for a new place to rest. Even now, when I drive past that section of the neighborhood, people still slow down to stare at the rebuilt retaining wall, and every single time I catch myself thinking the same thing. Sometimes the most expensive lesson is the one people insist on teaching themselves. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and until all this happened, I would have described myself as the most boring homeowner in Brookstone Ridge. I work as a civil estimator for a construction company outside Asheville, North Carolina, which means I spend my days looking at grading plans, drainage drawings, and engineering reports that most people would rather use as a pillow than read. Maybe that's why I never had much patience for arguments based on feelings when the facts were sitting right there on paper. My wife, Lauren, used to joke that I trusted a survey marker more than I trusted people, and honestly, she wasn't wrong. We bought our house 5 years earlier because it backed up to a beautiful wooded slope that gave us privacy from the homes built higher up the hill. The only downside was the grade. The backyard dropped almost 3 feet near the property line, and every heavy rain sent water racing along the back edge of our lot before continuing downhill toward the shared walking trail behind 3 neighboring homes. Before we moved in, the previous owner had tried controlling the erosion with railroad ties that had long since rotted away. After our first spring storm, half the flower bed washed into the drainage ditch, and I knew the problem wasn't going away on its own. So I did everything the right way. I hired a geotechnical engineer, paid for a soil evaluation, submitted grading plans to the county, waited nearly 6 weeks for permit approval, and then contracted a licensed masonry crew to build a 40-foot limestone retaining wall with proper drainage fabric, gravel backfill, and perforated drain pipe. It wasn't cheap, but I wasn't building it because it looked pretty. I built it because gravity doesn't negotiate. The finished wall blended into the landscape so naturally that most visitors assumed it had always been there. More importantly, it worked. For 4 years, that hillside stayed stable through thunderstorms, tropical remnants, and one particularly nasty winter that saturated the entire neighborhood. My backyard remained level, the drainage stayed predictable, and the homeowners uphill probably never realized that my wall quietly protected part of their own properties too. Honestly, I didn't expect them to. Good infrastructure is invisible when it's doing its job. Things stayed peaceful until one Tuesday afternoon in early May. I had just pulled in my driveway after work when my next-door neighbor, Gary Mitchell, waved me down before I could even get out of the truck. Gary had lived there almost 20 years and had developed the kind of sixth sense every long-time HOA resident eventually earns. He looked at me with that uncomfortable half-smile people wear when they're about to tell you something you really aren't going to enjoy. "Ethan," he said, lowering his voice, "did you check your mailbox today?" I laughed and told him I usually ignored it until Lauren reminded me there were bills inside. He didn't laugh back. "You should probably look before dinner." That was enough to make my stomach tighten. Sure enough, tucked between grocery coupons and a flyer advertising roof cleaning was an official violation notice stamped with the Brookstone Ridge Homeowners Association logo. I stood there reading it twice because I honestly thought I'd misunderstood something. According to the letter, my retaining wall violated community aesthetic standards because the limestone materials were considered inconsistent with the architectural character of the neighborhood. I had 30 days to remove the entire structure or face fines of $150 every week until I complied. I actually laughed the first time I read it. Not because it was funny, but because it felt impossible. I walked inside, spread every page across the kitchen island, and Lauren looked over my shoulder before asking the same question already running through my head. Didn't the county approve that wall? They did, I answered. Every inch of it. She frowned. Then maybe this is just a mistake. I wanted to believe that too. After all, reasonable people looked at evidence, admitted when they were wrong, and moved on. At least, that's what I still believed before I met the man who had recently become president of our HOA, a retired insurance manager named Douglas Mercer, who seemed far more interested in winning arguments than solving problems. At that point, I still thought a folder full of permits would settle everything. Looking back now, that was probably the most naive thing I did during the entire ordeal. The following morning, I took a personal day from work, partly because I wanted to deal with the letter before it turned into something bigger, and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that someone at the HOA had simply overlooked the paperwork. I pulled the original county grading permit from my filing cabinet, printed the engineering report, added copies of my property survey, showing every boundary pin, and even included photographs from the construction process. Looking at that stack of documents, I honestly felt almost embarrassed for the board. Surely once they saw everything, they'd realize the violation notice had been issued by mistake. I submitted my appeal that afternoon, then waited. 2 weeks later, an email arrived inviting me to speak at the next monthly board meeting. Lauren squeezed my hand before I left and smiled. Just stay calm. Facts usually win. I smiled back, but I had no idea facts were about to walk into a room where they weren't welcome. The clubhouse was packed that evening. Most residents only attended meetings when something affected them personally, so seeing nearly 40 people inside told me word had already spread. At the front sat 5 board members behind folding tables, but everyone's attention naturally drifted toward Douglas Mercer. He was the kind of man who somehow managed to turn volunteer work into a full-time personality. Even at neighborhood cookouts, he wore an HOA badge hanging from a blue lanyard around his neck, as if someone might mistake him for an ordinary resident if he didn't. He greeted people with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," he said after calling my name, "you have 5 minutes." I placed my folder on the table. "I don't think I'll need that long." I walked them through every document one by one. County permit, engineering approval, soil report, property survey, construction invoices, photos. I even highlighted the section of the CC and RS that never once mentioned retaining walls built under municipal approval. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for several seconds. One older gentleman sitting near the back actually nodded to himself while reading the copies I'd handed out. Then Douglas leaned back in his chair, folded his hands together, and smiled like someone humoring a child. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, "this community has standards." "I understand that," I answered. "That's why I followed every legal requirement before I built the wall." Legal doesn't always mean appropriate. I blinked. Appropriate according to whom? According to the architectural vision of Brookstone Ridge. A few residents exchanged confused looks. I kept my voice calm. "Can you show me where the governing documents prohibit limestone retaining walls?" He tapped the binder in front of him without opening it. "The board has discretionary authority regarding community appearance." "Discretion isn't unlimited authority," I replied, "especially when the structure is entirely on private property and approved by the county." His smile disappeared. "You're challenging the board?" "No, I'm asking you to point to the rule." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything either of us had said. One board member quietly flipped through the CC and RS as though searching for the same answer. Another avoided eye contact altogether. Douglas finally cleared his throat. "Your appeal will be reviewed." That was apparently the end of the discussion. As residents filtered out afterward, several stopped to whisper that they thought I'd made my point. Gary patted me on the shoulder outside the clubhouse. "You had him cornered." I shrugged. If the documents speak for themselves, this should be over. Gary looked toward the building where Douglas was still talking with 2 board members. I wouldn't count on that. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. Appeal denied. 30 days to remove the retaining wall. Failure to comply would result in fines of $150 per week until corrected. There was no explanation, no reference to any governing document, no response to a single piece of evidence I'd submitted. Just a signature from Douglas Mercer beneath the words "final decision." Lauren stared at the letter in disbelief. "They didn't answer any of your arguments." "No," I said quietly, "because they couldn't." That night, I barely slept. Part of me wanted to hire an attorney immediately. Another part wanted to ignore the letters entirely. But neither option felt right. Around 3 in the morning, I walked into my home office, spread the survey across my desk again, and started reading every page of the permit file I'd kept for 4 years. Something kept bothering me. The wall wasn't required by law. It wasn't an easement. It wasn't jointly owned. It wasn't protecting county infrastructure. It belonged entirely to me. Around sunrise, I called an attorney I'd worked with through my company, Melissa Grant. After listening patiently, she asked one simple question. Ethan, who owns the wall? Edo. Can the county force you to keep it? No. Can the HOA legally require you to remove something they have no authority over? Apparently they think they can. She laughed softly. Whether they can or not isn't the interesting question. Then what is? If they insist on removing something that benefits everyone else, what happens after it's gone? I didn't answer immediately because for the first time my brain stopped focusing on legal arguments and started thinking like an estimator. Loads, water, soil pressure, drainage paths, gravity. I drove home and spent nearly an hour walking behind the wall. I measured the slope again, checked the drainage outlet, and watched where runoff naturally wanted to travel. The wall had quietly redirected thousands of gallons of stormwater every season without anyone noticing. Remove it, and the hillside would eventually try returning to its original shape. I wasn't hoping for disaster. Quite the opposite. I hoped the weather would stay dry long enough for everyone to realize what a mistake the HOA had made before nature got involved. Still, engineering doesn't care about hope. That afternoon, I called the county grading office. I explained that I intended to remove a previously permitted retaining wall because my homeowners association had formally ordered its removal. The woman on the phone paused before asking me to repeat that last part. They're requiring you to remove an approved retaining structure? Yes. Mom, could you send us a copy of that notice for our records? Absolutely. Within an hour, I'd emailed the violation notice, the denied appeal, and a letter stating that the removal was being performed solely in response to HOA enforcement. 2 days later, I rented equipment and contacted the same masonry contractor who had originally built the wall. The owner recognized my address immediately. Something fail? He asked. No, Ian Surat. Actually, it worked too well. He frowned, completely confused, until I handed him the HOA notice. He read the first page, looked back toward the backyard, then slowly shook his head. I've been doing retaining walls for 28 years. This may be the dumbest thing I've ever read. We dismantled the structure carefully over 4 days, lifting each limestone block without damaging it and stacking every piece neatly along my driveway. There was no anger, no dramatic destruction, no revenge. Just quiet compliance. Douglas happened to drive by on the third afternoon. He rolled down his window, wearing the biggest smile I'd ever seen on his face. Looks like you finally came to your senses, he called out. I smiled politely. Just following the board's instructions. Glad we could resolve this. So am I. He drove away, convinced he'd won. Gary walked over after Douglas disappeared around the corner and stared at the exposed hillside where the wall had stood for 4 years. You know what's coming if we get a big rain, right? I looked toward the dark clouds, building over the mountains in the distance before answering. Gravity has been very patient. Neither of us said another word as thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the ridge. And for the first time since this whole mess had started, I realized the next chapter of the story wasn't going to be written by lawyers or HOA board members. It was going to be written by the weather. The rain started 12 days later, just after midnight. At first, it sounded harmless. The steady rhythm of water tapping against the bedroom windows, the kind of mountain storm we'd lived through dozens of times before. I rolled over, glanced at the weather app on my phone, and saw a flash flood advisory had just been issued for the county. Lauren looked at me in the dim light and asked quietly, "Are you thinking about the hill?" I nodded. I've been thinking about it every day since the wall came down. Neither of us slept much after that. Around 6 that morning, I walked onto the back deck with a cup of coffee and immediately noticed something different. The water wasn't flowing where it had for the last 4 years. Instead of being guided along the reinforced drainage path, muddy runoff had begun carving fresh channels straight through the exposed slope. Small rocks bounced downhill every few seconds, followed by clumps of saturated soil that grew larger each minute. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. If anything, I felt disappointed because I knew exactly what was happening. And I also knew it could have been avoided so easily. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from Gary. "You need to come outside." I walked around the side of the house, just as a deep rumble echoed across the hillside. It wasn't loud enough to sound like an explosion. It was slower, heavier, almost like the earth itself had sighed. Then we watched an entire section of the upper slope begin to move. Wet soil folded over itself, carrying shrubs, mulch, decorative stone, and several young trees as it slid downhill before spilling across two rear patios and completely burying part of the community walking trail. Patio furniture tipped over. Fence panels twisted sideways. A storage shed shifted several inches off its foundation. Water continued pouring through the fresh scar on the hillside, turning everything below into a river of mud. Homeowners came running outside in rain jackets, shouting to one another while trying to move flower pots and outdoor furniture out of the way. Within minutes, Douglas Mercer arrived in his SUV. Gone was the confident smile he'd worn while watching my retaining wall come down. His shoes disappeared into ankle-deep mud as he hurried toward the damaged trail, yelling into his phone for landscapers, contractors, and emergency maintenance crews. The irony wasn't lost on Gary, who quietly muttered beside me, "Funny, suddenly that wall doesn't look so ugly anymore." I didn't answer because there was nothing left to say. Nature had already made the argument better than I ever could. By that afternoon, the county had received multiple drainage complaints from residents whose patios and yards had been buried beneath several inches of mud and debris. 2 inspectors arrived before the rain had even stopped. They photographed the slope, measured the erosion, examined the drainage path, and eventually made their way to my driveway, where the limestone blocks were still stacked neatly on wooden pallets exactly as we'd left them. One inspector looked at the stones, then looked at the empty hillside. "This is the retaining wall from the permit file?" "Yes, sir." "Why was it removed?" Instead of answering from memory, I walked inside, retrieved a folder, and handed him copies of the HOA violation notice, the appeal denial, and the letter I'd sent the grading office before demolition began. He read every page without interrupting. His partner did the same. Finally, the first inspector slowly closed the folder and sighed. "You documented everything. I figured someday someone might ask." He nodded once before looking back toward the damaged hillside. "Good thing you did." Douglas tried approaching the inspectors a few minutes later, insisting the association had only been enforcing neighborhood appearance standards and couldn't have predicted the consequences. One inspector politely stopped him. "Whether you predicted them or not isn't the issue. You directed the removal of a permitted stabilization structure without consulting the county." Douglas opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd met him, he had absolutely nothing to say. The investigation stretched over several weeks. Engineers hired by the HOA concluded that the slope now required extensive reconstruction, including a new retaining system, additional drainage improvements, reinforced soil stabilization, and restoration of the damaged walking trail. The estimated cost climbed well into 6 figures before landscaping was even included. Insurance companies began asking difficult questions. Homeowners started attending board meetings in record numbers. Some wanted answers. Others wanted resignations. One elderly resident stood up during an open forum and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "We didn't have a hillside problem," she said while looking directly at Douglas. "We had an ego problem." The room went completely silent. A month later, Douglas resigned from the board. The remaining directors quietly voted to settle several disputes with homeowners instead of continuing expensive legal battles they were unlikely to win. As for me, I eventually rebuilt the retaining wall, this time after the county completed additional engineering recommendations and after receiving written confirmation that the HOA had no authority over its design. Ironically, the association never mentioned the wall again. Every now and then, someone asks if I regret taking it down. The honest answer surprises people. I regret that it ever became necessary, because I never wanted anyone's property damaged, and I certainly never wanted neighbors caught in the middle of a fight that should have ended with one look at a permit. But I don't regret standing my ground. There comes a point when constantly protecting people from the consequences of bad decisions only encourages them to keep making worse ones. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't revenge, anger, or shouting the loudest. Sometimes it's simply stepping aside and allowing reality to do what reality has always done. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have kept paying unfair fines just to protect the very people who created the problem? Or would you have complied exactly as instructed and let the consequences unfold? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always divide people right down the middle. And if you enjoy real neighborhood conflicts where patience, documentation, and the truth eventually win, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's convinced an HOA is always right. You never know who might need the reminder that gravity doesn't recognize authority. It only recognizes physics.